whenever I think about when did I start to get interested in longevity, I can't really quite put a date on it. And in my mind, there was really never a time where I wasn't interested in it. When I was really young, I remember having lots of discussions with my dad late at night because I didn't want to go to bed. Because to me, sleeping was like a small version of dying, and I was terrified of it. That was, I think, the first time I realized, okay, there's something here. It kind of like more stems from like a really deep appreciation for life. All the experiences that we can have, all the kind of like wonderful connections that we have, the friendships that we make, the incredible family connections that we have, I think so precious. And I think thinking as a child about the fact that one day they may not be there anymore was, I think, too much really for some time. And I remember clearly that there was a time when I was young where I thought I could eventually read all the books in this one area that I was really interested in a fantasy area. And as I grew older, I realized, nope, that's just not going to happen. Books are being produced at a faster rate that I could read them. And that was also, I think, like just really saddening. And I thought I would explore so many places that, you know, like you just don't have time to do that in one lifetime, right? From a very early stage on, I think I realized with my kind of fear of sleeping that there was a fear of death interrelated with it. And I think for a while it was mostly kind of like seen as like, okay, she maybe has some abandonment issues or some, I don't know, just like sleep problems. But I think that, you know, as I grew older, I really started to get much more interested in the science around longevity and like where we actually are right now. But for the most part, I didn't really know just how far behind we were. I'm Allison Duettmann, and I'm the CEO and president of Foresight Institute, a Bay Area research organization that supports the beneficial development of ambitious technologies for positive human futures. I grew up in a small suburb from Hamburg, a small town, relatively small town in Germany, and I thought that I can't really do very much, like help move the longevity field forward, and it's just going to progress the way that it's progressing. But I think that one moment really rang true to me when I think I was maybe 18 or 19 or something, and my dog, who I'd had for I think 13 years or something, passed away. And I had been following the cryonics space a little bit, and cryonics is biopreservation and basically being vitrified after you're dead, with a kind of like hope that in the future, through technological advancement, you can be reanimated again. So I'd been tracking that since I was really young and thought it was kind of just a technology that existed out there in the world now. So I was like relatively pleased about that. Then when my dog died and I was actually doing research on like how could I possibly have my dog vitrified now and frozen, I guess, how you say it colloquially. I realized that's just not going to happen. Like you can do that, but you have to sign them up really early, and even then, like the chances are pretty small. But I think that's when it really hit home to me, the kind of state of longevity research, cryonics research, and like related fields, and that it's time. And so I think that at that point I got much more serious about it, and I think that also kind of coincided with growing up, realizing that perhaps the longevity wish, like local wish for me to continue and to be part of a flourishing civilization, was really grounded on the bottleneck of civilization to continue. I don't know if you remember, like as a kid, you often just have this perception that history has been forever and it will forever just like continue, like life is just like a given. But I think realizing that perhaps civilization as a whole may be in jeopardy, realizing that was like, I think the second kind of like big update that I had in my life. The fact that civilization in itself may not have longevity. You know, we have various different existential risks, you know, including AI, bio-risk, computer security vulnerabilities, climate crisis that we have. And I think realizing that maybe the entire human project could be in jeopardy was like, I think the second really big update. And so I think then I focused all of my energy on that, because that is, I think, the more important one. Like, it would be nice for me to be around, great, but for that, I think there needs to be a world in the first place. I moved away from Hamburg to study in the UK and focused on AI safety. My master's dissertation was on safe AI, and that was, God, I guess 10, 11 years ago now, so it was like pretty early for that stuff, and so early that even I think my philosophy professor, even though we had done trolley problems, like this is like a very niche area within philosophy, up and down, those are like very kind of armchairy philosophical questions that are very abstract, and we had that through the entire program, and then he was like, well, AI safety, that's so abstract. And I was like, are you kidding me? Like, we've been doing these abstract problems for the whole time, but AI safety is too abstract for you. But it was like really early on in that space. There were just a few communities on the internet that were even like discussing this stuff. And so I did like vicarious research on this, got really hooked. Eventually through that, I found Foresight Institute. Foresight Institute has been around since 1986. I think we had a very, very early website. It's foresight.org. The fact that we could claim that is like, I think a real interesting sign for how early it was. And I found them on the internet and like went into our archives. And there were like all of these people in the Bay Area that were just doing like some like really ambitious thinking about what the human future could look like and how we could get there and how we could kind of like lift humanity forward, even like all the way back then when technological progress really wasn't there at all yet. So I got really, really inspired, went down a few rabbit holes. They were very focused on molecular nanotechnology, and that was kind of like the founding vision of Foresight, but had a really big longevity aspect in it from the get-go, really big neurotech aspect, space aspect, because all of these could be applications of molecular nanotechnology. And so then I eventually just was like, okay, I just have to cold email them. And so I did that. I think at the beginning, I just want to volunteer from afar and see how I can help them forward. And then they were just like, well, why didn't you come over? And I was like, over? Like to the Bay Area over? And they're like, yeah, just come over. And so then I hopped on a plane. And then I stayed here, I guess at the beginning, it was for 3 months, I think. And I just helped with a few workshops and stuff and absolutely loved the community. And I think arriving in the Bay Area for the first time, my life really turned from black and white into color. Like I really remember just like thinking, oh, now I'm not the weird one out, has this like one weird kind of like focus on, individual longevity and civilizational longevity. But here it's actually like a pretty common cause area that people care about. Broader Bay Area community, in particular within the Foresight one. I think my first thought was like, why didn't I discover this sooner? And then being quite grateful that Christine, the co-founder of Foresight, took me under her wing, and gradually I took on more and more roles within Foresight until now, I guess 10 years later, really leading the organization. Back, I guess, in 1986, when we were co-founded, we were founded on this book, Engines of Creation, which was a book that was written by Eric Drexler, back in the day, one of the co-founders. And it kind of laid out this really ambitious vision for humanity using molecular nanotechnology to address a variety of different challenges. So I remember, I think one of my first workshops actually like helping run. And I remember it was so small that we were in, I think it was a gentleman's club or something in Palo Alto next to the squash courts in a tiny workshop room. And it was a few, like hardcore nerds. And then I think there was one investor and one philanthropist that was interested, but it was really tiny. The community, like everyone knew each other back then. And obviously this is now much later, not in the 80s. Everyone knew each other back then. It was a really small field. And you could count the companies really on one, maybe two hands. And then like in the past, maybe 5-6 years, the space started really exploding and lots of funding came in, lots of new research came out. Now lots of new companies are started in that space. So I think you really see kind of like the different kind of like S-curves of technological development like happening within the longevity space, where like people at the beginning that are really interested in it, not much happens, something takes off, it's still really lagging in funding, and then like it goes in these very long cycles that are kind of like hard to expect if you're very impatient about this technology. But now I think we're really at a state where you have DAOs like VitaDAO really focusing on this. You have like multi-billion dollars being poured into different areas, and so I think we're at a relatively good place in that now. Safe to say though, cryonics is still the one that is like now the niche area. I'm not saying that like everyone should have the wish to live for a very long time. Like that's not what anyone in longevity I think would try to make you believe. Like I think the main big thing in longevity is more about like creating more choice options for people. We value freedom of choice in most of our areas of life, right? And I think the one area that is the foundation for all the other areas of freedom of choice to exist is whether we're alive or not, right? And so in that we've kind of just like given it away, or like we've accepted that we don't have that. And I think rather than thinking about like what's possible now, I was really interested in like thinking, okay, what would we want to do if we did have longer lives? I think that if we did have longer lives, like I would like to do many different degrees, not just the one that I did, but like there's so many different areas to explore, places to see, and like just experiences to have. And I think that want for like a longer, more flourishing life is something that I think not everyone shares, but some people do. And I think for them, creating that opportunity to kind of lean into it is really important. But I think some people may just like actually not care, and that's totally fine. But I think for others, it's also really uncomfortable to think about if we accepted that that death at the current age of 80 something is not great, and aging, like the frailty that comes with it, is not great, then that would be terrible because we're all going through it, right? It would be like this kind of catastrophe that is happening to us at the end of our lives, that we're like all moving towards. And that's a really uncomfortable thought, right? Like this terrible, terrible thing happening to everyone that you love around you is, I think, really hard to swallow. Sometimes when I start thinking about it, I just can't believe that life is ending. It's just really uncomfortable to think about that, knowing that we may not have the technologies to get there in our lifetime. And so I think that psychological switch is really hard to make. I think that's the first one. And then even if you've made that switch and now think that longevity is important, right, which like now more and more people are doing because there's more technological development coming along, so it's a little bit safer for people to actually think about a possibility of that working. But if you then have to make the second really uncomfortable switch that we may not make it through, and maybe cryonics is the thing that we have to do, I think that is a very, very hard step. So I think within longevity now, cryonics or like biopreservation is really, I think, the area that is like massively undervalued. There isn't much good science in that area yet. Like I am signed up to cryonics, but like the current techniques are just like nowhere. They're just not going to get us there. And I think it's especially uncomfortable to think about if you already care about longevity. So I think, yeah, we're making progress, but unfortunately, I think not fast enough. At least for me, there is a connection between the individual longing for like wanting to have a longer, healthier life with rich and deep friendships and experiences and so forth, and the wish for civilization to continue flourishing. And I think that it's related kind of like at the root of like, we have a really wonderful thing going on here as humanity. Why not just like try to push it forward and see where we can go? And I think that there's so many really just absolutely things that we can't even think about right now that could be just around the cusp now. Like I'm sure that like now with AI timelines coming down, like I actually looked at the Metaculus, it's the forecasting community, and their timeline for the arrival of AGI, I think, and 2 years ago was 2057, and now it's at 2031. So it dropped, by 20-something years in the span of 2 years. So basically people have much shorter timelines now on AGI really arriving. And obviously that's really risky, and I can talk about that in a bit, but I think it definitely means that we're like at the cusp of something, right? Something is going to happen very, very soon. Civilization just has so much potential if this future goes well. We have just barely gotten started. I think if we now think back of, for example, how people lived 200 years ago, right? And what the status of technology, what the status of like health, what the status of like education, what the status of personal well-being was back then. We've made so many strides, and like I cannot even imagine what the next like 10, 15, let alone 200 years may look like. And I think that this potential of finding ourselves on planet Earth, barely having come into consciousness, barely having learned how to think, barely having learned how to cooperate as a civilization, that this would all go to waste now, I think is like unthinkable. And of course, then you have the Fermi paradox, and like, do we have maybe different multiverses, and like how much do we actually have to care about this one Earth? But I do think that we just don't know if we're the only ones out there right now. And so I think we have this kind of like this cosmic endowment that we have to kind of like cherish and really like carry along. And I think it would be such a shame if we just let it go to waste over some stupid geopolitical conflict or something. Like we have something really wonderful and actually kind of miraculous going on here. And I think just seeding the universe with life and like seeding it with the consciousness that we already have here on Earth is kind of like our duty to some extent, because we just don't know how many others are out there. I think that is like a pretty strong, I guess, like, I don't know. I do think about that all the time, to be honest. And I think that we're not really doing a great job at keeping our planet alive, keeping the people around us alive and happy. But I think we could be doing better. And I think fear of like an individual death is kind of like also like a local version of the larger fear of like civilization ending. And I think that especially, well, there's various different existential risks, but like I think in the Bay Area, most people are concerned about AI safety and like risk from artificial general intelligence. And I think there, like, timelines have been coming down a lot. We're not well prepared. There has been like, AI has been a discussion, in Foresight communities and like related Bay Area communities since we've been around. But back in the days, people still thought we had much longer time and like it would be very different systems than we have, the deep learning systems that we have now. And now it just like suddenly all kind of like exploded in the past 2 years or so. Everyone's suddenly hyper aware. And I think we're just like not prepared for this. And so I think doing everything that we can, which is like our second biggest focus area at Foresight really, to really like help the AI transition going well is, I think, something that I like absolutely deeply care about, because that is kind of the civilizational part of longevity, right? The personal part of longevity is great, but we can't have it without really like having a civilization to strive in the first place. Every technological path that we have has its own risks. It's not just AI, but on the AI front, I think there's various different risks involved with AI. I think if you just think like short term, right, AI could be massively exciting, probably the most exciting thing that we will ever develop. Like if we think about what brings us most of the things that we care about now, it has to do with intelligence. Most of the kind of like stuff, most of the kind of like technology that we're using right now, all that is built on intelligence. Now, if we up that by 100, what future could we live in? Like I think it's fantastic. And then there's like so many ways in which it couldn't go wrong, because intelligence is arguably also what creates most of the risks to society already, right? Intelligence is what created nukes. It created nuclear energy, great, but it also created nukes. And so I think we have to be really, really careful with that one. And there's like kind of short-term risk of just like, you know, like some of the misinformation stuff. I think the computer security stuff is one thing that we care about a lot at Foresight, with the kind of idea here being that we haven't been living in a kind of like secured civilization for a long, long time. Like our computer security is really, really bad. And it's kind of a wonder that we haven't just like totally torn down kind of like part of our communications infrastructure so far. Like, and I think there's various different theories of why that is, like including one, for example, that, well, many governments are just collecting 0 days. 0 days are basically exploits that have not been used yet, so entirely new exploits. And a few of the theories are saying one of the reasons why civilization hasn't crumbled yet, or our like computational infrastructure, is because different nation states are just kind of like collecting 0 days for a day that they may really need them to kind of like wage cyber war on another nation. So that has been a problem that has been with us for a long, long time. But I think now with AI, it's just getting much, much worse, because yes, on the long term, you could also use AI to improve computer security. I absolutely do think so. But I think for now, you already see we're really, really difficult to do in kind of like exploiting vulnerabilities. You can already automate some of that with AI now. And especially if you think about security of AI systems, stealing like really, really powerful models and then making them do things that could harm civilization, that's pretty dangerous too. And like it's really difficult to actually secure these models because some people have access to it, obviously, within the labs. And it's actually difficult to secure yourself against a nation-state threat actor. And so I think computer security in itself, big problem, and especially when vis-a-vis AI, because I think the types of stuff that we could be, if you just think about if none of the computational infrastructure worked tomorrow, that would be a very, very, very crass world. And I think that after 3, 4, 5 days, it would just get like pretty dark, and including, for example, nation states pointing finger at each other, blaming each other. And I think we're like now at a cusp where the kinds of exploits that could be doing some of that may not just be within the hands of nation state actors anymore, but like over time they could actually be rolled out to various other technological actors. And so I think there's this kind of like risk of small kills all, where the proliferation of technologies in general, but especially of AI, will also allow like a smaller number of actors to cause much, much larger harm. So you're kind of like democratizing also the ability to cause massive harm. And the same is true for biorisk as well. Like the AI models and even just the natural language models, if they have not been properly RLHF, aligned, they can already tell you like quite some dangerous stuff of what you could do to humans. And so I think we really need to kind of be careful there and building better defenses. I'm not sure if we can stop or halt much of the progress. I think the cat's out of the bag, but I think we need to get better at defense. We need to get better at computer security. We need to get better at like defense once an attack has occurred. For bio, the same thing. We need to build better kind of like monitoring and defense layers that really like help us like spot threats early and account for them. At Foresight, one of the things that we've done over the past, roughly a year, perhaps a little less, we started like an AI grants program, and that focuses on 3 areas that we think are underexplored for AI safety in particular. I should say there's a ton of amazing AI safety work out there. Anyone who's interested, you should absolutely kind of like just start Googling it. There's a bunch of different really interesting safety orgs out there. But we try to kind of like pick the fields that are perhaps a little bit like underexplored within the AI safety space. And so we kind of like focused on 3 different areas. So one of them is the security and cryptography area of like how can we actually have better security. The other one is on multipolar, safe and beneficial multipolar AI scenarios. Sounds like a handful and very abstract, but the idea here is that some people are worried that eventually we may create like a singleton AGI that kind of like rules the world and displaces the rest of civilization as the kind of like reference as the relevant framework for intelligence. Now, before we get there though, if we ever get to one super intelligent singleton that rules the world, and I sure hope we don't, at least there will be a time, a transition period, and arguably we're already in it, where different labs are building very different AI systems, right? And often they're specialized on different areas. And so we need to kind of figure out, how do we exist in a world in which we not just have humans, but in which we also have AI systems that we're increasingly cooperating with. We have evolved over biological evolution and culture evolution, like these really incredible things of how we as a civilization cooperate with each other. Like, we're really good at spotting liars, for example. Like, we're pretty good at that now. Obviously, we're also pretty good at deceiving, but like, we're also pretty good at spotting liars. We have things like reciprocity, like things like trust that have all evolved to kind of like better help us cooperate to a beautiful, flourishing future. But AI systems just don't share any of our kind of like substrate, and they don't share any of our cultural evolutionary history. So that means that they have pretty new ways in which they can trick us that we have not evolved to pass. One of that track is like really focusing on like creating like a new kind of like game theory or simulations of like different humans and AIs interacting with each other, and actually modeling how that has to pan out now. Like what new strategies do we need to cooperate? And then I think the one that I'm most excited about, because it's also a pretty positive one, not just all doom and gloom, is our neurotech track for AI. The idea here is that many people have been interested in neurotech for really quite some time. There's a ton of amazing projects out there and people have been building like crazy in the field, but there has been this one area within neurotech that has like always been pretty sci-fi, and that's whole brain emulation. So in 2008, Anders Sandberg and Nick Bostrom at FHI published this whole brain emulation roadmap. That was the first time that like a credible roadmap for whole brain emulation was put on the map, basically. That was really exciting, but then nothing really happened since then, or like not many people have been working on this. It was always like a super sci-fi topic. It was kind of like laughable if you like made some musings that you want to work on this stuff. But now with AI timelines coming down so much, people are kind of like, I guess, worried enough that they consider these more alternative approaches. And so whole brain emulations and other various like neurotechnology efforts like brain-computer interfaces are like a really interesting AI safety hedge. And so that's because they can serve a variety of different functions. Like if you could actually emulate an entire human brain, we would kind of have like a human native software-based intelligence. And it's not that we can perfectly align other humans with the good, but like at least we know what these software intelligences are like, much more than the alien minds that we're currently dealing with. So that would be great. Even if we can't, let's say, actually get a full whole brain emulation, maybe we get something like a lo-fi upload. So a lo-fi upload is something that has only been coming onto the scene as a meme or concept in the past few years. It's basically like, can we use really good data collection on biological data and behavior data of, let's say, an organism, let's just have a model organism like a mouse, to actually like really predict really well what that mouse is doing and actually like track what's going on in that brain. If we could do that well enough, maybe with some help of like machine learning and deep learning, we can actually create something like a lo-fi upload, which is just like a really good model of that organism. That could maybe already help us align different AI systems better. Obviously not of a mouse, that won't really quite get us very far, but like a lo-fi human upload or something like that, of just like a generic of like how a human would usually act. We could maybe use that kind of almost as a bridge or like a help to align AI systems better. And the last one is brain-computer interfaces. Like that's like a technology that like also has been making fantastic progress, just like independently of AI. Like that field is just really popping. But I think especially for AI, if we have a better way of like actually interfacing with the intelligences that we're trying to better cooperate with, we can learn a lot more. We can like think a little bit more like them. We can actually like find better ways to actually communicate like what we want. And so I think brain-computer interfaces is possibly another area within the neurotech space that's really exciting. So those are a few of the areas, I guess, that we are funding with the grants program. Especially I think the neurotech one, I think, has a lot of promise and has a lot of also really wonderful applications. Like I think we think a lot about, or I guess I've just spoken a lot to the doom, but I think one thing that really excited me about Foresight when I first found it on the internet is that people were not pessimistic. They were not just doom and gloom about the future. It was the only pocket of the internet where people were actually kind of like excitedly and optimistically planning for flourishing futures without being Pollyannish about the risks. And I think we need to also think about the kinds of worlds that we do want with these technologies. Yes, it's great to maybe have these neurotechnologies for AI alignment, but like what other things could they be doing? I think space of experience that could possibly be unlocked with neurotechnologies is absolutely fantastical. Like, of course, we want to kind of like raise the bottom in the sense of like having many people that like suffer absolutely terrible, like mental illnesses, mental diseases, like help those folks. People that have disabilities, help those folks with neurotechnologies. But we could also really like explore very different experiences spaces. Like we could communicate much closer with other minds, including like other sentients, for example. That kind of like positive space of what kind of like future do we want in this technological path is one that I think is always neglected. I think especially now, folks are pretty doomy. And it always looks like the world is going to end tomorrow. But I think if we don't dream up better worlds in these different tracks, we will surely not get there. And so I think it's important to also consider like the positive aspects of those tracks. I think one thing that really like attracted me so much to Foresight is that when I found it on the internet, it was this kind of like pocket on the internet, or in the world really, that was like deeply optimistic. And I think that sometimes you have like optimism that is like, just kind of like almost philosophical, or like, you have transhumanism and you had like extropianism, like various different like philosophical strands of futurisms before, but they're not really like that action oriented often. And then often on the science and technology side, you have like incremental progress that's happening, but people don't really talk about the kind of like far out implications of that work because they don't want to be speculative. And I think within Foresight, we actually found this like pocket of people that actually cared a ton about the long-term future and had like these wild, crazy dreams about it, but at the same time also had a really solid scientific background and were actually working on real stuff in the real world to try to get there. And so I think that really attracted me, and especially this notion of like positive futures that was kind of like rippling through the entire organization. It was already pretty bad when I was younger, but especially I think recently, like I think this doom and gloom that we have in the media is like sometimes just a little bit like arresting, and it can, I think, really lead to fatalism of like not even like seeing a path out of where we currently are in. I think like every day you get bombarded with like a new kind of like cycle of a new war that has broken out, and or like a new climate catastrophe that's happening over here. And I think most people that like are just kind of bombarded with this stuff, I think actually like have this almost feeling of like overwhelmment at like the challenges that we face. And I think that can lead to, some feeling of like, why even bother? Why even bother doing anything, right? And I think that we have to counter this really radically. And I think it's a really, really big problem that we have. If you look at the sci-fi that was written like in the 80s, much of that stuff is really optimistic about the future, right? And if you look at the sci-fi, that has kind of like henceforth kind of like come into being, it's like pretty negative. Like we mostly have dystopias that are kind of like being written about the long-term future. And I think the problem is like we can't really build what we can't imagine. One thing that is like I think somewhat annoys me a bit about the existential risk focus that I really have in myself, and like I think in some of Foresight's work, it almost feels like trying to like address different risks, but like it doesn't actually mean that we're on a good track to a positive future. So I think we're just like stuffing different holes, but like we can do that. Like there's so many different ways to go wrong, but there's only a few paths really that will, I think, lead us to like really positive worlds. And I think that we should focus more on those paths. One, I think because we're just like more likely to like actually have project development along those paths if we actually think about them more, and if we actually just kind of like think about what kind of world would we want if we don't get wiped out by AI in the next 5 to 10 years. And then on the other hand, I think thinking about positive paths is also a little bit more collaborative. Like oftentimes I think we're in this kind of zero-sum dynamics with others in the world of like the things that we do not want. And I think that actually like collaborating and like kind of like putting goalposts out there that if we collaborate, we could possibly get there as civilization is super inspiring, and also creates a much more collaborative and cooperative spirit. And there's this like notion that kind of like periutopian goal alignment, which is basically the idea that like, through a lot more automation and through a lot more technological progress, the space of possible benefits that we may achieve if we cooperate gets much, much larger. So actually the incentive to cooperate also becomes bigger along the way. I was a bit worried about the relatively, I think, ubiquitous and kind of like doom and gloom culture that we have in the media in general. But then there were a few really interesting projects, like, for example, Our World in Data, which is from Max Rosa, where he tracks just all the progress that we've made in civilization so far. And I was like, wow, we need more of that. And so I guess since I've been like, doing all of this research on these different orgs when I was still back in Europe, I basically like kept score of like various different positive roadmaps for positive futures, positive sci-fi in different fields, positive like just posts on like what we could be doing with technology progress if we don't wipe ourselves out. And so I kind of kept this like a list of links or of resources for a while. And then this paper came out from Toby Ord and Owen Cotton Barrett on existential hope and existential risk. And so if existential risk is the kind of like possibility for humanity to kind of like wipe out and lose our potential, then existential hope is the opposite of like the upside risk of humanity. What could happen if we don't kill ourselves? And so I think that was just like a really exciting way to think about the future, of like flipping this like pretty doomy framework for thinking about the future on its head and think instead about the positive worlds. And now through that, we've launched this like website, existentialhope.com, on which we like really try to collect a lot more of the kind of like positive fiction, positive like different proposals for what we could be doing in different technological areas, or just like really like kind of like more world builds of like what these futures could look like, and actually just inspire in people a little bit more this kind of like wanting and thinking and even exploring for themselves about what they may want in the future, and to give people a bit more agency back. And I think that we need a lot more of that. And I think that most of the scientific areas that we have definitely have a communications problem. I think it's really tricky to talk about them, not just because some of them are perhaps more controversial or perhaps more niche, or sound perhaps a bit more sci-fi, but like also because I think scientists are sometimes not the best communicators of their work. It's pretty jargony. And I think like helping people understand the worlds that we could be having if some of the science and tech worked out is, I think, a pretty undervalued space. So I think we would love to do much more work on that. We've done a few world builds where people actually like think about kind of like a world in 2045 that has like not AGI, but like a pretty strong version of AI, but in which other technologies are really flourishing. What could that world look like? What are the governance mechanisms in that world? What is a day in a life in that world? What is the kind of backcasting path of how we got there? And we just finished a course on that. It was absolutely amazing. And I think just like inspiring people a bit more about thinking about these worlds in a creative manner is, I think, something that we could be doing much, much more of. If you're listening to this now, I think it would be really wonderful if you asked yourself, like, not only, for example, like what kind of questions would you like the answer to with AI, but also what new questions could you ask? If you think about molecular nanotechnology, if like, what would you be building if externalities were not an issue? If you actually had this kind of bottom-up technology that could build really from the ground up, from a nanometer scale, various complex products, what worlds would you be building? Right? What machines, what devices would you be building with this? If you ask yourself in longevity biotech, like, what would it look like to live in a world you meet not only your grandkids but your grandkids, and have these like really rich like kind of long-lasting relationships with the people around you, and which you could like really like plan for a really long-term future, in which oftentimes we think of like, I think a long future or like our lives is just like this one book. We have one narrative arc, and then eventually, you know, like you can like hit the peak and maybe around 50, 60, whatever, and then you can like drop off and then the story's over. Think of like a life in which basically like your life was more a collection of short stories where you have many different iterations. What would these different short stories look like for you? Where would you go out? Like, would you go out into space? Would you stay at home? If you go out into space, how far would you go? What would you build? And I think like thinking a little bit more along those lines, even though it can sometimes seem disheartening that we're not quite there yet, but at least I think it like can kind of like give you a little bit more of agency of like, what would a world look like that you actually want to inhabit in? I think striving more towards the things that we actually do want, I think would be a pretty valuable antidote to the current kind of like doom and gloom and like running away from things, but never really towards a positive future.